All right, so in this video, we're going to start a series on the growth and decline of empires. So, in case you're keeping track of this stuff, this is going to take us through chapters 30 through 32 in the textbook. And this is our initial stuff on chapter 30, which is what's going on in North America in time period 5. And so, despite what you might think about what's going on in North America, it's really not that different from what's going on elsewhere in the world, because there is a growing American empire in North America. And so today what we're going to talk about is the growth of the United States and the reactions that American neighbors took to this growing American empire. So soon after American independence, the British gave the new United States all the territory between the United States and the Mississippi River. And then in 1803, the United States buys Louisiana from Napoleon. And we talked about that in our video about the Haitian and Latin American revolutions. So pretty much overnight, the United States has almost tripled in size in about 25 years. And Americans start to believe it is their destiny to control North America from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And this idea is known as manifest destiny. Now, in terms of the way we've been thinking about political ideologies, manifest destiny is kind of a combination of liberalism and nationalism. So we get the liberal side comes through in allowing all white men to vote. And then after the American Civil War, all men could vote, although that really wasn't true. So it's not really within our purview in world history to cover stuff like the Jim Crow laws, but officially all men could vote, but there were all sorts of weird laws keeping most African Americans from voting. But that's not really our point here. The point is that there was this idea that if you were an American, you could participate in government. And that is definitely a liberal idea. But there's also this nationalist idea that being American is better than being anything else you might find in North America. So it's better than being Canadian. It's better than being Mexican. It's better than being a Native American. And the Americans are going to try to take over to prove it. And that's the nationalist side. Being American is better. And we're going to prove it to you by beating you in wars. That way you have to be American. So over the 19th century, Americans come into conflict with pretty much every other nation in North America. So we'll cover each one of these chronologically. And then afterwards, we'll talk about the reactions of the nations after they've come into contact with the Americans. So first up are the Canadians. And at this point, the Canadians are still British. So the big conflict between the Americans and the Canadians slash British is the War of 1812. So basically, the War of 1812 was an offshoot of the Napoleonic Wars. The US traded with everybody because they were neutral. And the British believed the Americans were helping the French. And so they go to war. And the United States invaded Canada to weaken the British, maybe draw some troops over to North America. That was the idea. They wanted to weaken the British, so they invaded Canada. And the Canadians beat the Americans. And what this did was it created a distinct Canadian nationalism. It united all the different types of Canadians in one shared moment. And from that point forward, Canada is a thing. Now, to kind of finish the story of Canada, because they're not really going to be too much involved in this story after this, in order to prevent a future rebellion, because the British had seen this before. Like, the United States became a separate nation because of the tax structure that the British were imposing on them, and that sparked the American Revolution. The British had seen this before, and they wanted to prevent another revolutionary war. So, in order to prevent a future rebellion and possible war of independence, the British give the Canadians more and more autonomy. So they're given autonomy to kind of control their own taxes, their own education, and then finally, in 1931, they're given autonomy over their own foreign policy. So basically, at that point, they are independent. Now, they still share the Queen as their technical leader. Like, the Queen of Great Britain is still technically in charge of Canada. But the Canadian Prime Minister makes all the decisions for Canada. And that's a much more peaceful way of getting independence than what the Americans did. The British slowly gave them more and more and more autonomy until they were just completely autonomous, and the only thing that the Canadians still are connected to the British through is the Queen. So she's still on their money, but that's about it. Now, the next group that we're going to talk about are the Native Americans. So, as the Americans, as the United States spread further west, they encountered more Native Americans. And as we've talked about this before, American views on how to use land were different than Native Americans. Basically, if you weren't using the land, if you weren't improving upon it, meaning that you were building on it or farming on it, that meant that it was free land. And so Americans just took it. In their view, it wasn't being used. And so as the Americans came into contact with more and more Native Americans, there is a growing conflict between the two groups. In 1831, the United States passes the Indian Removal Act, which forces Native Americans off their land. And this was primarily in the southeast United States. And so this gives us what's known as the Trail of Tears, which was a forced march from what is now Georgia, Alabama, and Florida of the Native American tribes in the area, like the Cherokee, I believe the Creek, and others. There were other tribes in there too. But they were all forced to what was called the Indian Territory, which is in modern Oklahoma. Thousands died. And eventually this ended in 1837. But this is usually considered an early act of genocide or ethnic cleansing, because we're trying to get rid of this group of people so that Americans can come in to use that territory. So again, this is an idea of nationalism. It's also an idea of liberalism, because we want our people to be able to participate, and we want to have those people leave. Now, as the Americans moved further west, they encountered Native Americans who fought back. So one example of this is the Battle of Little Bighorn, which took place in 1876. And here, the Sioux Indians, or I'm sorry, the Sioux Native Americans, the Sioux tribe, defeated the American army and this was a really big event because up to this point, the Native Americans had never beaten the Americans in an actual battle, and it had finally happened. This changes American policy and now the Americans, the U.S. Army, starts killing the buffalo to start starving the Sioux and other Western tribes out. And the end result of all of this happens in 1890 with the Battle of Wounded Knee, which really shouldn't be called a battle because this was basically a massacre of Native American women and children and elderly and after this the Sioux surrendered and went to live on a reservation. So the Americans are more or less doing the same thing that other empires do. They are taking territory, encountering other nations, and incorporating them into their societies. This is not really any different than what the Spanish were doing in North America and South America before American independence, and it's not going to be that different from what the Europeans are about to do in Africa and in China. So it's a good idea to start thinking about the Americans as an empire because they're doing a lot of the same thing that Americans do. We'll continue this story in the next video when we talk about how the Americans dealt with the Mexicans. And then we'll talk a little bit about how these societies started to mesh together. And that'll be in our next video. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.